there's a special kind of loneliness that comes with standing on a train platform, watching hope die one whistle at a time. I've seen men face down rattlesnakes with steadier nerves than what I witnessed that October morning in Cedar Falls, when pride and desperation came dressed in calico and traveling boots. Now, I've told my share of tales around campfires from here to the Rio Grande, but this one's got teeth. It's about what happens when a woman's got nowhere to go but forward, and a man's got nothing left to lose but his solitude. It's about the difference between wanting somebody and needing somebody, and how sometimes, God Almighty, they turn out to be the exact same thing. So pour yourself some coffee, friend, the kind that's strong enough to wake the dead and black as a moonless night. Because what I'm about to tell you happened when the leaves were turning colors and the whole territory was holding its breath, waiting for winter to show its hand. The morning train from Kansas City wheezed into Cedar Falls like an old man climbing stairs, steam hissing and brakes squealing against iron rails that had seen better decades. Most days that train carried nothing more interesting than seed catalogs and letters from back east. But this particular Tuesday it carried Charlotte Hayes, though she wouldn't be keeping that name much longer, or so she thought. Charlotte stepped down onto the platform, carrying everything she owned in a carpet bag that had belonged to her mother, and wearing a blue traveling dress that had cost her 3 weeks' wages from the shirt factory. She was 26, which made her practically a spinster by Missouri standards, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that held more intelligence than most men were comfortable with. She'd answered an advertisement in the Kansas City Star. God-fearing rancher seeks educated wife for companionship and partnership. Must be of good character and willing to embrace frontier life. The letters that followed had been formal but kind, signed by one Jeremiah Caldwell, who claimed to own a spread north of town and promised a comfortable home for the right woman. Charlotte had sewn her wedding dress during the evenings by lamplight, dreaming of wide skies and a man who might value her mind as much as her ability to cook biscuits. She'd sold her mother's china to buy the train ticket and spent her last dollar on a pair of white gloves that made her feel like someone worth marrying. She stood there on that platform, clutching Caldwell's letter and watching the handful of passengers scatter into the dusty streets of Cedar Falls. The town wasn't much to look at. A few dozen buildings squatting under the big sky like afterthoughts, connected by roads that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. But Charlotte had seen worse. She'd grown up in the Mill District of Kansas City, where the air tasted of smoke and broken dreams. This felt like possibility. Minutes ticked by. 10, 20, 30. A small crowd began to gather. The kind of folks who didn't have much excitement in their lives and weren't about to miss whatever drama was unfolding. Mrs. Abernathy from the general store whispered behind her glove to Mrs. Hutchins from the boarding house. 2 cowboys lounged against the depot wall, making comments that weren't meant for polite company. "You sure you got the right day, miss?" asked Station Master Kowalski, his tone walking the line between helpful and condescending. Charlotte checked the letter for the dozenth time. Tuesday, October 15th. 2 o'clock train. She pulled out the small mirror from her bag, wondering if something was wrong with her appearance, if maybe she looked different than the photograph she'd sent. Standing at the edge of the gathering crowd, unnoticed as shadows, was a man named Sam McKenzie. He ran cattle on a spread about 10 miles north. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep him fed and independent. Sam was pushing 40, with hands that knew hard work and a face that had spent too many years squinting into the sun. His wife had died of fever 7 years back, and he'd been living alone ever since, talking mainly to his horses and his hound dog, Blue. Sam had come to town for supplies and stayed to watch the train come in, the way men do when they're looking for reasons to postpone going back to an empty house. But when he saw Charlotte standing there, suitcase in hand, and hope fading from her eyes like sunset, something stirred in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. An hour passed, then 2. The platform emptied except for Charlotte, who sat on her carpet bag like it was a throne, chin up and eyes dry despite the whispers and pointing fingers. That's when Kowalski cleared his throat and approached her with the swagger of a man delivering important news. "Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I got word about your situation." He held up a telegram like it was evidence in a murder trial. "Jeremiah Caldwell ain't coming. Seems he up and married the preacher's daughter last week. Left town this morning for California." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear Charlotte's heart breaking, or maybe that was just the wind through the depot rafters. Charlotte stared at the telegram like it was written in a foreign language. The words swam before her eyes. "Regret to inform, circumstances changed. Wish you well." A sound escaped her throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. More like the noise a person makes when they realize they've been fool enough to trust in fairy tales. "Well, I'll be," chuckled one of the cowboys. "Looks like Caldwell got himself a better deal." "Poor thing," whispered Mrs. Abernathy, loud enough for half the territory to hear. "What's she gonna do now? Ain't got no family here, no prospects." "Could always try the saloon," suggested the other cowboy with a grin that made Charlotte's skin crawl. "Pretty gal like that wouldn't go hungry." That's when Sam McKenzie stepped forward. He moved with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd learned that hasty actions often led to regret. His boots clicked against the wooden platform as he approached Charlotte, who was now standing again, her carpet bag clutched in front of her like armor. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was rough from disuse but gentle as Sunday morning. "I couldn't help but overhear your predicament." Charlotte looked up at him, really looked. He wasn't handsome in the way Jeremiah Caldwell's letters had suggested he was. Sam's face was weathered and lined, his hair more grey than brown, and his clothes spoke of hard work rather than prosperity. But his eyes were kind, and kindness was something Charlotte had learned not to take for granted. "I'm Sam McKenzie," he continued. "I run a small spread north of town, nothing fancy, but it's got a good roof and a stone hearth that keeps the winter out." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. What I'm fixing to say might sound forward, but Sam shifted his weight, suddenly looking younger, despite the lines around his eyes. "I got need of a wife. Not for romance, mind you, but for companionship, someone to share the load. Cook some meals that don't taste like saddle leather, maybe read a book out loud in the evenings." Charlotte's cheeks flushed red as autumn leaves. "Mr. McKenzie, I appreciate your offer, but I barely know you. You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible cook, or have a shrewish temper, or could be." Sam agreed with something that might have been a smile. "But I figure anyone who can sit on this platform for 3 hours with her head up and her dignity intact is probably made of sterner stuff than most." He paused, choosing his words careful as a man picking his way across thin ice. "I ain't offering love, Miss Hayes. Can't promise something I don't have to give. But I can promise respect, a roof, your own space until you decide if you want to stay or move on. And if I want to move on, then I'll give you stake money for wherever you want to go, and we'll call it square." The crowd murmured like wind through wheat. This wasn't the kind of proposal they'd expected to witness. No declarations of undying devotion, no getting down on one knee, just two practical adults discussing a practical arrangement. But Charlotte heard something else in Sam's offer, something that sounded remarkably like hope wearing work clothes. "There's a preacher in town," she asked. "Reverend Morrison. Good man. Known him 15 years. Charlotte looked around at the faces surrounding her, some sympathetic, some cruel, all waiting to see what the abandoned mail-order bride would do next. She thought of the shirt factory back in Kansas City, the 12-hour days and the foreman's wandering hands. She thought of her empty room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, where the walls were thin and the dreams were thinner. Then she looked at Sam McKenzie, this stranger who'd offered her something more valuable than romance, choice. "Mr. McKenzie," she said, her voice steady as mountain stone, "I believe I'd like to see this ranch of yours." Reverend Morrison married them that same afternoon in the little white church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Morrison playing hymns on an out-of-tune piano, and Blue the hound dog serving as the only witness who seemed genuinely happy about the proceedings. Charlotte signed her name Charlotte McKenzie for the first time, the ink still wet when Sam helped her into his wagon for the ride to what was now, legally speaking, her home. The McKenzie spread wasn't much to look at from the road. A modest cabin, a barn that had seen better decades, corrals that needed mending, and pastures that rolled toward the horizon like a green gold sea. But it was clean and well tended, and when Sam carried her bag to the door, he didn't carry her over the threshold. Instead, he handed her the key. "Your house now too," he said simply. That first winter tested them both. Charlotte learned to cook on a wood stove that had its own temperament, to milk a cow named Bessie who liked to kick, and to read weather signs in the way clouds gathered over the mountains. Sam learned that his new wife was as handy with a rifle as she was with a needle, that she could birth a calf as easily as she could quote Shakespeare, and that her laugh was a sound worth coming home to. They slept in separate rooms, as agreed, talked over meals about everything and nothing, the price of cattle, the books she'd read, his plans for improving the range, her ideas about planting a garden. They worked side by side during calving season, sat together on the porch during summer evenings, and played checkers by lamplight when the snow piled deep. And somewhere between Christmas and spring thaw, something shifted. It started small, the way Sam's hand lingered when he helped her down from the wagon, the way Charlotte found herself humming while she cooked his favorite meals, the way they both stopped mentioning the separate sleeping arrangements. One evening in late March, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Charlotte set down her mending and looked at her husband, for that's what he'd become in truth as well as law. "Sam," she said quietly. "Yes. I've been thinking about what you said that day at the station, about not having love to offer." Sam's jaw tightened slightly. "Charlotte, if you've decided to move on, I understand. I'll keep my word about the stake money." She reached over and took his weathered hand in both of hers. "That's not what I'm thinking at all." She paused, feeling brave and terrified all at once. "I'm thinking that maybe love isn't something you have to start with. Maybe it's something you build, like a house or a ranch or a life. One day at a time, one choice at a time." Sam looked at her then, really looked, and saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Not the desperate gratitude he'd expected from a woman with nowhere else to go, but something deeper, something that looked remarkably like love, wearing everyday clothes and speaking in a voice that had learned to call his name like a prayer. "Charlotte McKenzie," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that I came here looking for a husband I'd never met, and I found one I never expected." She smiled, and it was brighter than all the sunsets they'd shared. "I'm saying that practical can become precious if you give it enough time." Long pause, like the settling of dust after a long journey. They had 43 years together, Sam and Charlotte McKenzie, raised 4 children who knew their parents' love story and understood that the best marriages aren't built on lightning strikes, but on the steady accumulation of small kindnesses and daily choices to stay. When Sam passed in his sleep at 82, Charlotte found a letter he'd written her, tucked inside the Bible they'd shared. It said simply, "Thank you for teaching me that love is something you do, not something you feel. Thank you for choosing to do it every day." Now I've told you this story, not because it's the most dramatic thing I ever witnessed, though that day at the depot surely had its moments, but because it reminds us that sometimes the best things in life don't come wrapped in pretty packages with fancy ribbons. Sometimes they come wearing work clothes and offering practical solutions to impossible problems. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you're standing on a platform with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, kindness comes walking out of the crowd, offering not everything you dreamed of, but everything you need to dream again. The territory's full of love stories, friend, but the ones that last, they're built on something stronger than passion. They're built on choice and respect, and the daily decision to see the best in someone, even when they're at their worst. Trust me on that. I saw it with my own eyes.